Escaping Denver, Supplementary. Interview with Jonathan K. All right, let's jump right into it. Yes, we're at a bit of a standstill when it comes to Noah and Sarah's journey, but that doesn't mean the work stops. I don't know about you, but I still have more questions than when I started this, and I don't plan on waiting out on any more magical messages to help me solve them. I'm going to continue doing what I've been doing so far, trudging along, researching where I can research, and talking to more experts when the opportunity arises. While it's relatively easy to look up some of the things Noah says or alludes to, or that Sarah interacts with, it's a little harder for me to understand Noah himself. Sarah, I get. I don't know her, but I get her. She didn't believe in any far-out conspiracy theories before she found herself waist deep in it, and that I get. Noah, on the other hand, believed. I've got hours of messages that should be proof enough for me that the world has way more going on than I first thought, and even I'm still on the fence. Noah had nothing. From what I can surmise, he probably lived a very mild and inoffensive life before all this started. He went on adventures of the mind, but I'd be surprised if he owned an actual pair of hiking boots. He believed without having experienced anything, at least not that he's mentioned. But what made him believe in the first place? That's what brought me to journalist and author Jonathan K. He wrote a great book on the conspiracist underground that exists in the United States and how easy it is to fall into that mindset. He's the perfect skeptic to help me understand Noah's thinking.
So we are here with Jonathan K., author, journalist of the book Among the Truthers. It's a long title. Among the Truthers, A Journey into the Growing Conspiracist Underground of 9/11 Truthers, Birthers, Armageddonites, Vaccine Hysterics, Hollywood Know-Nothings, and Internet Addicts. That's a title. And you cover a lot in this book. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
So I'm just going to jump straight into it. You're a journalist. You're a legitimate journalist. You've covered all sorts of topics. What brought you down the rabbit hole of pursuing these conspiracy theorists, or conspiracy theories, really?
This was in the late 2000s, and I was an editor at a newspaper, and I was always getting letters. I mean, this is the era when people would send in physical letters, but I'd also get email and even phone calls from people who are clearly deeply invested in conspiracy theories. And especially in regard to 9/11 conspiracy theories, I was amazed at how much time and energy they'd put into it and how detailed these theories often were. These weren't dumb people. Many of them, in fact, I think were highly intelligent. And I became really interested in why they thought these things. And that's really what the book is about. And this is an old book. This came out 10 years ago. And a lot has changed since then. But that was my motivation.
And what did you find was attracting people into these theories?
In some ways, the answer, although a lot of the stuff that I talked about in the book was new, so like, web video was new, loose change. There were a lot of, the production cost for web propaganda, video propaganda was coming down, so you had a lot of people, whereas it might formerly have cost like $1 million to make a documentary about 9/11 or something, you could now do it for a few $1,000s. And so I talked about these new phenomena, but a lot of what I talked about was literally ancient. Mankind's obsession with the roots of evil, the roots of suffering. Why do bad things happen to good people? Religion exists to some extent to answer those questions. We now live in a largely post-religious society, so we need different ways of answering these questions. But the other thing is distrust. And explaining evil is different from venting distrust, because distrust is often a secular phenomenon. You distrust your government, you distrust your media. You can also distrust religious authorities. And you see that, among Catholics, for instance, the last few decades, we've seen a lot of distrust because of revelations about sex scandals. But distrust in public institutions is an absolutely universal element among conspiracy theorists, because when I would ask them, like, when did you start believing these things? It always would start with some variant of, well, when I realized I was being lied to by the media or by government or by big corporations. And that creation of a spirit of distrust, often it set off a chain reaction, because they say, well, if the media is lying to me about this, what else are they lying to me about? And I say media, I mean, it's all our public institutions. And distrust isn't, it's very difficult to contain distrust in a person. So for instance, in our personal relationships, if you distrust a person with money, you often will distrust them in regard to everything, like as a romantic partner, or as a truth teller, or as a teammate, or as a coworker, or as a supplier, or like
the distrust spreads.
Distrust spreads within a personal relationship, but it also spreads within one's attitude towards society at large. It's very rare that you meet somebody who will say, "I completely lack trust in Justin Trudeau's, for instance, ability to manage the economy, but I completely trust him to manage our foreign relations," or so. I mean, usually if a person distrusts a human being, they distrust him across the board. So because of that, there's no natural limit on where that distrust will take you, which is why sometimes a legitimate sense of distrust, because it is legitimate to question the motives of politicians or business leaders or the media. We should be doing that. You can't just trust everything. But because there's no natural limit on where that distrust takes you, you see a lot of very smart people take it all the way into some really extreme views about, 9/11, where Barack Obama was born, the moon landing, vaccines. It was going back to your original question, it was an explanation for an explanation for evil, for why bad things happen, number one. And number two, a way to express a runaway sense of distrust in the power sources in our society.
Well, yeah, you say in your book essentially that what the 9/11 truthers have in common with essentially all conspiracy theories, or a great deal of them, is that there's a single overarching power,
right?
Maybe access to some sort of sophisticated technology, or access to some sort of tool that the normal everyman does not. And then also that the media is likely part of it.
Right. So the way the human mind works, and you see this in movies, you see it in religions, where the human mind, and I can't totally explain this, but the human mind is very bad at conceptualizing multiple sources of evil. So if you like, there's very few movies where there's like two villains. Like there's, I'm not even sure I can think of one. It's usually like one villain. Religions that have a point source of evil, it's like, there's a devil, or there's maybe multiple devil figures, but there's like a head devil. And political, like extreme politics, it's usually about tracing all the evils in the world to, like, with Protocols of Elders of Zion, which is anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, is like this small group of Jews who wanted to wreck everything. But you saw that in other forms of conspiracy theories, like it was the Illuminati, or it was the Trilateral Commission, or it was
New World Order is the one.
New World Order, yeah. Often, like, people obsess over George Soros, and George Soros is a very wealthy person, and not everyone agrees with what he does with his philanthropy, but like in the popular imagination, everything goes to him. I remember I was reading a Canadian author, a very popular woman, who wrote a book about capitalism, and she tried to trace everything back to Milton Friedman. Again, Milton Friedman, very influential economist, but I was just struck by the way that, like, in her imagination, and not just her imagination, it's like a popular thing across the political spectrum. It's like it always comes back to either Karl Marx, or some people are obsessed with Freud, or some people are obsessed with like a religious figure in their society, or a group within their society. So yeah, it's this point source thing, and I'm not sure it's as popular now because it's become a sort of cliche, but I talk about these like pyramid flowchart diagrams that a lot of these conspiracist movements had, which is you'd have some ultimate evil on top and it would spread its tentacles, depending on the metaphor, to all these subsidiary evildoers. And often in these diagrams, you would see the media represented. But the media is a more interesting thing because I talk about this in the book, how you would ask somebody, well, if this sort of evil conspiracy is going on, how come the media isn't reporting it? And they'd say, well, the media is in on it. So the media isn't just thrown in as like a random co-conspirator. The media, it's essential that they're there because, and then you'd say, well, how come, the judiciary isn't whistleblowing? Well, they're part of it too. And in fact, people ask me, how can you tell a conspiracy theory from a regular kind of just like skeptical attitude toward government? And I say, it isn't the content of what they're arguing, because people argue all kinds of things. It's the manner in which they argue. So the conspiracist technique for arguing is like, imagine a series of concentric circles where, the 9/11 conspiracy was hatched by Bush and Cheney. It's like, and well, what about the CIA? Well, they were in on it. Well, what about the media? Well, they were in on it. Well, what about, the House of Representatives and the Senate? How come they haven't investigated? Oh, they're in on it too. And so you keep expanding the set of concentric circles. And it doesn't matter what objection you have to the conspiracy theory, that objection can be overcome just by creating bigger and bigger circles. That manner of argumentation is foolproof because, anyone can draw big circles. But to my mind, that betrays the conspiracist line of thinking, because there's literally no evidence, or at least there's no authority figure you can cite that would disabuse the person of the conspiracy theory, because all they have to do is just expand their set of conspirators another level and they'll swallow it up.
Like a Russian nesting doll of
it's exactly
of
like
lies.
It is like Russian dolls. Yeah.
So my question is, wouldn't there need to be some seed of truth or something at the heart of it to kind of justify these rings? I mean, a snowflake starts on a speck of dust.
Right.
It needs that speck of dust.
Yeah.
Where does this nesting doll, where do these concentric circles start?
A substrate or a point of catalyzing. So the fuel of it is, as I said, distrust. Barack Obama's birth certificate is an interesting case study, because if you wanted to say, what's the seed of doubt, or what's the grain of salt there that's at the core of it, there is the fact, he was the most liberal president in American history, but that in itself is not a crime or anything like that. Barack Obama had an unusual backstory. If you look at the backstories of other presidents, tends to be kind of like more of a Leave It to Beaver type, very traditional, middle class, G-shucks childhood, and often lots of privilege. But Obama had like a genuinely unusual upbringing, and his father and his relatives on his father's side, some of them, they're very unusual backstories by the standards of American politics. And because of that, if you were inclined to think that he was some kind of interloper who had some kind of weird agenda, you at least had a kind of canvas to draw on. It wasn't like, for instance, I actually read Mitt Romney's, someone wrote a biography of Mitt Romney, and actually Mitt Romney's ancestors themselves are actually quite unusual, because they were, there was a whole Mexican subplot, and they were Mormons, as you know. And there's some in the 19th century, there was some pretty weird stuff in Mitt Romney's background. But in the last couple of generations, Mitt Romney's backstory, socioeconomically, is like just this completely normal, boring backstory for a lot of political figures have. And so in Obama's case, you had this extremely liberal politician who had a genuinely unusual backstory by the standards of American politics. And so people sort of projected any fantasy they wanted. Some variations of the fantasy were that, he was Muslim, he came from Indonesia, he came from Kenya. So people who had this idea that he was going to turn America into some kind of Afrocentric place, they focused on Kenya. The ones who focused on the Islamic thing, they focused on Indonesia as a possible birthplace. But they were trying to shoehorn it into some existing narrative of distrust. And this is another ingredient that I talk about. Conspiracy theories typically are theories of illegitimate power. So they look at the status quo, and at least implicitly, they try and make the argument that the status quo power structure is not morally legitimate. So, like in the case of European anti-Semites, they would look at the liberal governments of, or nominally liberal governments of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and they would say, these were installed, these are artificial governments propped up by Jews. In fact, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, as I remember, was created by Tsarist propagandists, Tsarist monarchists who were trying to discredit the forces of liberalism. And if you read the protocols, liberalism is heaped on this sort of great pile of intellectual crimes that are laid at the feet of Jews, along with capitalism and all this stuff. And it's the narrative is that the liberal course of European politics, at least following the 1848 revolutions in Europe, is somehow like morally illegitimate. And the proof that it's morally illegitimate is that it's being masterminded by these morally depraved individuals. And a lot of Barack Obama conspiracy theorists, if you scratch the surface and interviewed them, what they really were hoping to prove was that the election that brought Barack Obama to power for the first time was like somehow morally illegitimate. It's actually not that different from the narratives of Trump conspiracy theorists who have these. I mean, for them, it's not like this. It's actually, these conspiracy theorists are much more boring because they're not really about religion or ethnicity. It's about some the deputy secretary of state in Georgia or something like that. How he's like paid off by this or that. Like is that the case with any new conspiracy theory? The fresh ones feel less and less legitimate the longer the story. Because I'm a complete outsider, but right. I'd heard of the Illuminati. I'd heard of New World Order. Right. These have been around long enough that through osmosis, I've collected that information as well. But these fresh ones that aren't rooted in religion or aren't rooted in some larger form. Well, it's in a way, it's harder to create conspiracist mythologies now, just because everything is so richly documented. So, like the JFK assassination, the only film that exists of the event is the so-called Zapruder film. I think Zapruder was the name of the guy who filmed it. And it says like this grainy black and white thing. And one of the reasons JFK conspiracism is such a rich subculture is that if you go frame by frame through the Zapruder film, which like every JFK conspiracy theorist has done, there's all kinds of weird little details like the umbrella man or the grassy knoll or the angle at which, the president's head fell when it was hit by the bullet. And all of these little details become grist for analysis. If something like the JFK assassination happened now, it would be recorded by several hundred different people from several hundred different angles on cell phones and stuff like that. And as soon as somebody came forward with a theory about the umbrella man or something like that, there'd be 24 people on Twitter who are like, well, actually, here's a video that shows that that's not true. So it's now very easy to demystify or debunk conspiracy theories. Or in the case of JFK, like, the United States had to wait a long time for the official report into the JFK. Even in 9/11, it took something like 440 days for George W. Bush to order an inquiry into 9/11, and after that, it took a long time after. So it was on the scale of months and years that people actually got the full information. This is before the full use of before the cell phone camera era and before the social media era. Now you have all kinds of so-called citizen reporting and all kinds of things. And it's become much more difficult to create like a sense of mystic certainty about a conspiracist narrative, since so much evidence exists to debunk it. And we saw this in the case of the Trump conspiracy theorists who were certain that the election was stolen. Like, their claims usually just appeared preposterous because this was like one of the most carefully scrutinized elections in the history of the United States, for precisely this reason, that that everybody knew whoever won, whoever lost, there would be these kind of accusations. So it was very difficult to weave this kind of narrative, and as a result, the narratives that you do see just tend to be kind of ridiculous and more grubby. Like, you had Rudy Giuliani saying things that were untrue. Like, I mean, he became a figure of ridicule very quickly. Whereas, like, the best conspiracy, if you could use that term, the best conspiracy theory, the best conspiracy theories have the quality of kind of like an enchanting, eerie, kind of like action movie with compelling villain figures and tapping into deep fears that exist in all societies, like really dark fears about foreigners and evildoers and fifth columnists operating within our midst. It's like kind of Star Wars, where the star of Star Wars was Darth Vader. Luke Skywalker is actually a fairly boring character, and conspiracy theories is the same way. Is the real star is the villain, and you need a good villain to attract a mass following.
So in the case of Area 51 or the Denver airport conspiracy theory,
right,
and any of those are really just the arena. The villain is who's ever keeping it.
Yeah, I mean, hidden. UFO conspiracy theories are a little different because, like, UFOs are really cool. I don't know that I don't think there's any evidence UFOs exist. But the nice thing about UFOs is, to the extent they exist, we can like make up any form we want. So in the case of UFOs, one really interesting thing is that, I think I mentioned this in the book, that after ultrasound technology became popular for mothers to see what their babies looked like inside their stomachs, and everyone saw that it kind of looked, fetuses look, depending on your point of view, they look kind of creepy. And all these UFO movies started popping up in which the UFOs looked a lot like a fetus. And UFO experts, UFO reporting experts, people who wrote books about the UFO phenomenon, reported that it was around this time that people who claimed to have been abducted by aliens reported that the aliens looked a lot like human fetuses. Because clearly, like, in their minds, people were kind of like weirded out by the fact that they could now see inside a gestating woman's stomach. And it just influenced the way they thought about UFOs. And they projected their idea of what a UFO would look like on their sightings. Well, and like I said, this is one of the ingredients of a successful conspiracy theory, is that you have either a visually or a mythologically appealing villain figure. And I mean, UFOs are cool. They're exciting. In the same way, 9/11 conspiracy theories, like, there were all these really esoteric theories about like space lasers and holograms and, the functioning of NORAD and scrambling jets and internal demolition. This is Jason Bourne stuff. Oh, and as I wrote in the book, it's not surprising, like, most 9/11 conspiracy theorists are men. And if you went, I don't know if they still are regular, but if you went to 9/11 conspiracy theory conventions, like, people who take the conspiracy theory seriously, I'm not talking about like academics studying it. It was typically men, and the few women there were like the bored girlfriends or wives of male conspiracy theorists who were like into all this Buck Rogers, Jason Bourne, cloak and dagger stuff. Whereas there are other conspiracy theorists, other conspiracist movements centering around vaccines and stuff, which or health issues, which are predominantly female, but that's another story.
Well, so we talk about these, it's mostly men in these conspiracy theories. This pursuit of Buck Rogers, let's explore, let's see what's out there. That's been going on for ages. I don't know if it's describing, like you said, trying to come up with a definition for describe evil, but you talk about cryptids, you talk about Bigfoot, all along the western coast of the U.S. and Canada, very similar reports. All across North America, really. You talk about the chupacabra. You talk about some of these newer ones that are popping up. I mean, how are they even cropping up in an age where we have so much access to videos and proof? I mean, is the argument that it's lack of evidence is evidence, lack of evidence that they don't exist?
Well, it's like you could. I don't know if you've been to northern Scotland, but these, like the place where the Loch Ness monster is supposed to live. You know, I've been there. It's like it's not like the sort of lake we imagine in North America. Like these are really deep, dark, large bodies of water that go down hundreds of feet, and it's easy to imagine, if you let your imagination run away with you, that there is some kind of like horrifyingly large monster in there. And a lot of these monsters prey on our just natural fears about the wild, which is part of our evolutionary programming. Like human beings are wired to be scared to some extent of dangers that exist in the wild, whether it's snakes or sea creatures. I mean, there's still many parts of the world where people die regularly from being hauled into the water by crocodiles. And a lot of the monsters that exist in myth look a lot like a crocodile, or they look like another snakes or flying lizards, or giant beasts of the wild like lions or something, or they have the head of this and the body of that. Like it's essentially an extrapolation of our evolutionarily conditioned fears of, and we also have evolutionarily conditioned fears of outsiders, which is the root to some extent of racism and other forms of bigotry and xenophobia, which is in many ancestral environments in which our ancestors lived, it really was inherently dangerous to have any contact at all with members of people outside your kin group, because you didn't know whether they were competing for resources with you, and maybe their group is on the brink of starvation, and they might do horrible things to keep their families alive. Like these aren't, again, you talked about whether there was a grain of truth to a lot of these things. Our minds are conditioned to some extent for fear and distrust of outsiders, and conspiracy theories often represent an extrapolation of that psychological reality.
I only have one more question before we lose you for the day. Yeah. You talk to a lot of people, a lot of passionate people, right, who truly believed in their belief system of what was going on with their conspiracy theories. Were you ever compelled by the evidence? Did you hear anything that made you give more than just pause?
No, I didn't. But it's a lot of it is just your personality type. Like I'm the sort of person who, and this is why, I've never joined a political party, and I'm not a good fit for at my last job. I was a bad fit, because as soon as someone starts telling me, here's the ideological viewpoints we believe, like I immediately start looking to poke holes in them, because I resent the idea that they're propagandizing me or trying to draw a box around what I'm allowed to believe. And so, I mean, that's a personality thing. That's not an intellectual quality. That's kind of just who I am. And so I never came to however, it's an interesting question, because there was one event I remember. It was in Montreal. It was in 2009, and I went with a relative, and we went to go see this guy speaking about 9/11. And I remember specifically the guy was talking about Building 7, and Building 7 is this huge talking point. I'm not going to go into the details, but if you know anything about 9/11 conspiracist mythology, you'll know that WTC 7, World Trade Center 7, Building 7 occupies a huge place in their mythology. And this person I was with, who's, like me, similar educational background, similar outlook on life, similar politics, I could see they were getting kind of glassy-eyed. And they're like, oh my God, that's they weren't exactly saying, oh, it's all true, it's an inside job, wake up, sheeple. Like it wasn't like that. But I remember on the way home, we were like, she was, wow, that really, that was so spooky. And what do you think? And buildings don't just fall like that. And in the days following that, she stopped thinking that way. But I could tell that if she were with if I were a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, or her friends were 9/11 conspiracy theorists, or a more realistic scenario that she was like a YouTube fanatic and she was just like kept clicking on links to all these videos, because that's the thing, right? It says, it's related videos, and it takes you down a rabbit hole. Even if you don't want to go on a rabbit hole, like YouTube and other sites like it will keep suggesting thematically similar content. She easily could have become totally suckered into that field. But again, that's just this person's personality type. I have also seen this person become radicalized, at least temporarily, on other issues. And that's kind of just who this person is. And it's not a good feature or a bad feature. Like, to some extent, my skepticism of propaganda that I hear is like, it limits me to, I can't really join a political movement because I always sense that it's bullshit. Or like, I'm programmed to like actually search enthusiastically for something in it that I don't like. Like, it's just kind of my personality, and she's maybe a little bit on the other side. But it has nothing to do with intelligence. Like, this person is very smart, and it's against stereotype. This is a woman, so I said that almost all 9/11 conspiracy theorists are men. A lot of it is personality type. But what's interesting is that I think they have done studies, or at least they had when my book was published, about what are the risk factors for conspiracy theorists. And the only risk factor they could find is that you believe in other conspiracy theories. So if a person already believes in conspiracy theories about 9/11, they're much more likely to believe in conspiracy theories about like vaccines, or about the New World Order, or about global warming. Because again, we talked about how distrust metastasizes. And so,
is there a world where all of those, to use your term, concentric circles of their different conspiracy theories, that in some way they've justified how they overlap, a central point that connects them all?
Well, what connects them all typically, or at least when people believe multiple conspiracy theories, they tend to coalesce around a theory of evil. So if a person believes, like, I believe the globalists are behind all this, or I believe the Jews, or I believe the Muslims, or I believe it's whatever, the Freemasons or whatever. It's actually a little obscure. Most people don't. Freemasons have sort of fallen out of fashion. It coalesces around that. But the thing is, most of these groups, because it is imagined that these people want to control, like, literally the entire planet, there isn't really much natural limit on what you can shoehorn into that. Like, let's say you believe the globalists want to control the world economy, right? Well, everything is part of the world economy. So, like, what isn't part of the world economy? I mean, healthcare is part of the economy. The university systems are part of the economy. Politicians make huge contributions to determining who wins and loses in the economy. Like, so if that's your theory, then it could. I actually met a guy who was a Trump conspiracy theorist, and I asked him, and I mean, that's broad, but I mean, like, stuff. What I mean is that, the media, he won the election and they're not reporting it, and Trump is like super smart, but they're hiding the fact that his IQ is so high. Like, it was just sort of like this generalized sense that Trump was this wonderful guy, but everyone was like hiding the truth of this. But I asked him what had originally radicalized him politically. And you know what the issue was? The issue was local bike lanes. Like, he opposed the construction of a bike lane on a street. I forget what the reason was. I mean, there's legitimate reasons to not want to buy. I don't know, maybe you want to park your car and whatever. And then, like, he got involved at City Hall. He lived in a big American city. And I don't know, he didn't like the way he was treated. Or maybe, there's a lot of city politics in the United States are legitimately rotten. Like, this happens in Toronto. It's just, you go to a City Hall meeting and people act like they're not listening to you, and they have an agenda and they want to ram it through. And he became really incensed, and he kind of became a local activist, and he got on all these mailing lists. And the kind of people who were really active in local politics often, they have very strong political views about all sorts of things. And that was it. He was off to the races. And but he still talked about the bike lane issue. Like, it's not, he still would occasionally get into like a speech about the bike lane issue when he was talking about all this other stuff.
He wasn't able to move past the initial.
It was that, but it was also like his fascination with bike lanes. Again, there's an absolute grain of truth to it. So he believed bike lanes are promoted by environmentalists. True. He believed environmentalists oppose the use of the internal combustion engine and the automobile more general. True. He believed that Democrats in general are more skeptical of fossil fuels and big corporations than Republicans. Okay, true. So it's like 3 or 4 steps from national politics and enormous questions of national industrial policy and signing on to Copenhagen and Paris and all these international climate agreements. There is a linkage to local issues like bike lanes. It's not imagined. I mean, it's true. Like, and especially if you get on Twitter, the kind of people who are like promoting. Look, I love bike lanes. I'm a cyclist. But it is true that if you go on Twitter and the sort of people who are maniacs for bike lanes, like, they tend to be really hardcore environmentalists, or they're kind of like Birkenstock, granola types. Like, it's just, that's kind of the people who get really involved in this. I use bike lanes. I like bike lanes, but I'm not an activist. And they became his villain figure. Like, I think he was obsessed with the Sierra Club, and which also figures in a lot of these mythologies.
But so you start with bike lanes. Then right. Again, we're expanding to the next level that has to be involved, the next level. How that could go all the way to the very tops of government, right? Because it took you 4 steps to go from a local issue to a national issue.
Absolutely.
And I imagine just 2 more steps to an international. But
this was Alexandria, Virginia, by the way. This was this and this guy, like, he was a fairly well-known academic. Like, he wasn't. I'd actually heard of him before I interviewed. He was like, I visited him in his home. A lot of these guys I visited in their home, and I don't think I ever came away from any of these meetings like not liking these people, including, like, I'm Jewish, but including the anti-Semites. I didn't meet any anti-Semites who didn't give me any interviews, and they knew I was Jewish. They didn't care. They were happy to talk. I often felt sorry for these guys. I mean, often these guys were just weird guys, and they were floundering around intellectually trying to find some way to conceptualize the universe. But this bike lane guy was a super smart guy. He just, he couldn't get out of this sort of spiral he was in.
He was able to draw a line between all these things that made sense. And so he was able to start at a small level and work his way up to this grand level of what his linear progression of distrust. But does it ever go the other way? Couldn't it, for argument's sake, be said that the government who, the environmentalists who are against the fossil fuels are the reason that they're starting the bike lanes, kind of reverse engineering his thinking that led for him to become so radicalized? Isn't the argument that the other way brings you into it?
It's possible. I haven't thought systematically about that. What I will say, though, is that a lot of people who have really weird theories about politics on an abstract level, or like a national level or something, actually often will be very functional with their neighbors. And there was this case study in the book I talk about. I think it's under the rubric of Cosmic Traveler, where I think it was San Gabriel, California. It was an hour or 2 outside San Francisco. It was this guy who had these really ambitious theories about 9/11 and the security state, and how they're going to kill people, and everybody who exposes this is under threat. And it was really sort of action movie stuff. But the guy himself lived in this really open concept glass house where literally 70% of the house was made of glass, where even from the highway, you could kind of see him moving around in his bedroom. And I can't think of a more vulnerable way for a person to live. So he had made peace in his own personal environment with his neighbors, and his he had to live in the world. He had to wake up every day and buy food. A lot of these people, they say, "Oh, our food is poisoned, our air is poisoned." They're they go to the grocery store, they're eating food, they a lot of these 9/11 guys think that the government is going to shoot down all these airliners, but they're traveling by airliner all around the United States to give their presentations. And there was one guy, actually, his name is Richard Gage. I mentioned him in the book. I said, look, you talk about how the government has no compunction at all about murdering hundreds of people and shooting down airliners in the name of this conspiracy you have. But you're on a plane all the time because you're in demand to talk at universities about, to these credulous audiences about your conspiracy theories. Aren't you scared the government's like gonna say, "Oh, great, Richard Gage is on this plane. Let's shoot that one down"? Because to my mind, that's like a contradiction. But he freaked out because he thought I was threatening him. He thought like, "Oh, what are you saying?" Like, and it's true. I should have known better than to say that, because to a paranoid frame of mind, it does kind of sound threatening. But I said, "No, I'm not threatening you. I just think like I was trying to resolve the contradiction about how a person could believe the government is so horrifyingly evil and will kill all these people, and yet he conducts himself in the world exactly like the way you and I would conduct ourselves. Like we just kind of, we buy things, we go on planes, we visit people, we have credit cards, we vote in elections, like, and to a certain extent, it's just they have to compartmentalize their thinking, because if you take that level of paranoia and extend it to your everyday life, you'd become like you'd starve to. You'd never eat food, you'd never leave your house. You'd believe there were bugs everywhere, like talking about radio transmission bugs. And so they firewall their regular life from their theories.
Well, the wheel never stops turning. And if you've made your enemy the government, it's not like you're at a battle trying to, you have something to lose. It's almost as though you've already lost. If the government is behind all this, if there is a new, it seems like if there is a new world order, they're already running things. It's not a debate.
So there is a certain fatalism to it, that the enemy is so powerful that it's almost can't be stopped. But I think I mentioned this in the book, that to a certain extent, they're not trying to stop the enemy because it's so powerful, but they're trying to mark themselves as people who are like, in the Matrix, the blue pill, red pill thing. And I always forget, which is the pill that you take that it's like you see the truth.
I want to say it's blue, but
so whichever the pill is that makes you see the truth, they see themselves as people who have the courage to take that pill. And that's important to them, that they, and we all want to think of ourselves that way. We all, like, that's not unusual. We want to think of ourselves as people who reject comforting myths. I mean, atheists, that's a talking point among atheists, though. They'll say, I don't need your, the opiate of the masses to get through life. I recognize that the existence is pointless, but I still will persevere, because I'm more intellectually independent than all of you. So there's an element to that. And you're right, that it's sort of fatalistic. But even within the fatalism, they feel it's a point of pride that they have to tell the universe that, like, they know who's really running things. And so I'm sorry, I've talked a lot. I better go now.
No, thank you, John, for your time with us. This is great. I learned actually an incredible amount, and it's only going to lead to more questions, sadly.
I hope some of it is true.
I'm conflicted. I chose a skeptic because I myself am a skeptic. And he said everything I needed to hear. But isn't that confirmation bias? Everything Jonathan said about conspiracy theories made sense to me, as it would. How easy it is to fall into that mindset once you've started. How we're all eager to believe more and more if it reinforces what beliefs we already hold. But I went into this interview looking for those answers. I wanted to dismiss the messages I've been receiving, and I wanted an expert to give me permission to do so. Problem is, he and I also talked about how these beliefs tend to stem from a single grain of truth, and that gave me pause. What is Noah's grain of truth? Are these messages mine? Selfishly, I'm concerned for myself as I travel the slippery slope down the rabbit hole. I need to talk with more experts, as I'm wholly unprepared for this adventure. I too have never owned hiking boots. Alright, so thank you to Curious Cast for your support, and for Jonathan K. for sitting down to speak with me. He's written a number of books on a number of subjects, and he's certainly a worthwhile read. I'll be back in a couple of weeks if I can get another interview. Otherwise, I'll see you when I get new messages for another episode of Escaping Denver.